Great. So again, welcome everybody, and thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'm really excited about our topic at hand. Our conversation today is really centered around town forest governance, and I'll share a little bit more kind of about the plan for the webinar. But before we get started, I just wanted to take a little second and just introduce myself. So my role with the Urban and Community Forestry Program over, I would say probably the last 10 years maybe, has been primarily focused on supporting municipalities and volunteers around town forests here in Vermont. And so over the years, I've been involved in a variety of initiatives, such as many of you know, the Town Forest Recreation Planning Project, and have really gotten a chance to get out in the field, meet with town forest volunteers, talk to municipal officials, and really get to know many of the town forests around the state. And it's just absolutely been a privilege and an honor and a joy to be doing that work. So I'm really excited today to be here talking to you about this topic. Also joining me from the Urban and Community Forestry team is Gwen Kozlowski. Gwen, if you just want to turn your camera on and give a quick hello. Gwen is here supporting the webinar, monitoring the chat, and frankly, just making sure that everything runs smoothly. So thanks, Gwen, for your support.
Sure thing.
Okay, so our plan today is to start off with a brief overview of governance. I kind of wanted to just sort of provide some context and really set the stage for the conversation at hand. And then we'll take some time, I guess as we do that, sort of what I'll be talking primarily about and sharing is, sort of helping us kind of explore this question about what we mean when we say governance. And so to do that, we'll be kind of diving into the topic of governance, but then we'll also be talking a little bit about some of the research we've done here in Vermont with the help of the Northern Forest Center, who did an assessment looking at kind of different parameters around town forest governance here in Vermont. And then we'll round off that session or this, sort of the presentation around governance with the opportunity to kind of look at some principles that I've discovered and some ideas around what good governance looks like. And this is just really kind of meant to sort of help us start thinking about how this might translate into the work that you do in your community. And then we'll be joined by two community volunteers, Tom Kidder from the Tucker Mountain Community Forest in Newberry, and Pat Meaner from Heinsberg, the Heinsberg Town Forest, will be joining us to talk a little bit about their governance models and how they've made decisions within the context of their town forest. So, and then actually at the very end, we'll be wrapping up with what I'm calling kind of a panel discussion, sort of a Q&A. So again, I encourage you at that time to ask lots of questions. We have lots of expertise, both here in terms of the three of us who will be presenting, but as I look at the participants on the webinar today, I recognize that we all bring a lot of experience and expertise in this area. So encourage everybody to ask questions and participate in the chat box. Okay, so I wanted to kick off and just, kind of get us started by, first of all, asking you guys to introduce yourselves in the chat box. I'd love to just take a second for you to share who you are, where you're from, and maybe what your role is in terms of governance in your town forest, or maybe how you support town forest and governance. So please go ahead and take a minute to introduce yourself in the chat box. And as you do that, I wanted to share a brief introduction of myself and how I got engaged in this work. So the story of kind of how I got engaged in town forest governance work really started back in 2015. And many of you may remember that 2015 was a pretty important year here in Vermont because we celebrated our 100th anniversary of the enabling legislation that allows municipalities to create town forests. And so during that celebratory year, the Urban and Community Forestry Program held events around the state. And again, I really got the chance to get out, get to know some volunteers working in town forests, and had a lot of really interesting and important conversations to try to get a handle on sort of what was really happening on the ground in town forests. And one of the things that I learned as I was having those conversations is that, that making decisions was a really big challenge for a lot of volunteers in town forests. And that, sort of trying to make this decision about what uses do we allow, and how can we be better stewards or good stewards of the public forest resource, was something that was really challenging and on the minds of a lot of volunteers around the state. And so fast forward to 2018, 2019, these questions really kept coming up. And again, I kept hearing from communities that that they were having hard time sort of making decisions and really trying to identify kind of who was responsible for making those decisions, what were some of the good practices or best practices, if you will, that they should be using to make informed decisions about what was happening on the ground in the town forests. So thank you, everybody. I can see folks, we have a bunch of different folks joining us today on the webinar. Just calling out, I can't read everybody's welcome and introduction, but it's nice to see a mix of folks who serve on conservation commissions, folks who serve in the role of helping as practitioners in community forestry here in Vermont, as well as folks who serve on community forest committees. So again, welcome everybody. Okay. So I wanted to start off with this question about, what do we mean when we say town forest governance? It sounds really formal, right? And almost intimidating if you ask me. And, I don't know if anybody else feels that way, but the idea of governance, seems, this just seems like there's a lot to unpack there and a lot of, sort of formality about that phrase. And so I wanted to start off by, almost sharing, I call it sort of the bad news, right? I don't really think it's terrible news, but here in Vermont, one thing that I've discovered is that there's really no universal definition for what we mean when we talk about town forest governance. So sometimes bad news is also good news, right? And so what that means, we get to define it. And when I talk about town forest governance, and in my work, talking to other practitioners, I think when we talk about town forest governance, I think it really boils down to three main areas. The first one being process. And so what I mean by this is, this is really like how decisions are being made, right? The process by which decisions are being made. Not so much about what those decisions are, right? Because that's not really part of the process. It's how do we set up those decisions to be able to be made. The second component, I think, or the second main area when we talk about governance is stakeholders. So I think about this as kind of who are the players, right? And I think in our work around governance in town forests, we try to work and capture input and engage a whole range of different actors and players. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what that looks like and who those players might be in a little bit. But engaging those stakeholders, I think, is kind of the second main area. Excuse me. And then the third is what I would call local context. And this is, I think so much of the time when we talk about local governance or town forest governance, I think it's important to take into consideration the local circumstances, sort of the situation for each community that can dictate, both those opportunities around governance, but also the, potential constraints, right? It's almost like, to me, it's kind of like that local culture piece. Okay, so that gives us some context to talk about governance. I think the second thing that might be helpful for us, as we engage in this conversation, is thinking specifically about, okay, so, that kind of gives us three areas to be thinking about, but what do we really mean, right? Like, what are some of those activities that make up governance, or that, sort of specific activities that we can refer to when we talk about town forest governance? And so again, going back to those three areas, it's really, it's really all about kind of these various activities, I think, that happen to support those three pieces of the work that we do in caring for our town forests. And so when I think about town forest governance, I think, I think it's the governing bodies, right? It's like that sort of that group, right, that either makes the decision or does the work. And we'll talk about more about that in a little bit. It's also the policies, and I know many of you on the presentation today can probably relate to this, but a lot of the work of town forest committees and those governing bodies is setting policy, right? Who is allowed to use the forest, when, where, how. So policy development, I think is also another kind of important part of governance. But it doesn't stop there, right? Communication, I think, is another, and part of that is communicating out some of those policies and other, aspects of work in the town forest, or, sort of decision-making processes regarding the town forest. And then then financial management to me is another area. So, the question about where does revenue go in the town forest if there's been a timber harvest? Who decides and how is the decision made about how that money gets spent? Is there a stewardship fund? Is there a specific fund dedicated to the town forest that can support ongoing maintenance and management costs? And then stewardship planning, of course, I think is another big area. But those are just some of my thoughts. I'd love to just pause for a second and hear from some of you guys. What are some other activities? What are some other components of town forest governance that you think of? So I see Darren added into the chat box volunteer coordination. Excellent. What else? I also think of recreation planning. I know, sort of stewardship planning, but recreation planning, I think, is another whole area, of activities that more and more towns are getting pulled into. Are there other areas? Education. Thanks, Tom. Yes, of course, right? Sort of as models of stewardship, I should have thought of that one. That's great. Awesome. Well, continue if other ideas and other activities sort of come to mind. Please feel free to put them in the chat box. I see Pat talking about trail maintenance, invasives treatment. Exactly. Yeah. So there's kind of the work, right, as Pat says, that is entailed, in managing and caring for a town forest. And then Pamela mentions protection of sensitive habitats and species. Absolutely, right. So that conservation piece, I think, is also really important. The work of kind of identifying, right, and inventorying town forests, knowing what resources are there, and then making decisions about, their stewardship or their protection and conservation. Awesome. And then Pat adds people. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think we can all agree that a lot of the work of town forest management really is about managing people, right? Okay. Let's keep going. So, and parking, yes, thank you, Pamela. I see that one as well. All right, well, so as I started kind of wrapping my head around, what are we talking about when we talk about town forest governance? One of the areas that I think is helpful to look at, excuse me, and and could provide us with a little bit of clarity is looking at Vermont state laws. And I hesitated to put this slide together only because I want to acknowledge up front, I am not a legal expert. I'm not a lawyer. I'm coming at this, sort of having done some research to try to understand municipal laws, but I see that there's somebody from the Regional Planning Commission on the webinar today. And I know that there's a lot of other organizations and kind of legal expertise out there, who could help provide guidance for specific, town level questions. But I think, I think it's really helpful to look at sort of, as we talk about governance, to look at state laws to try to get a sense of like, okay, so, this question of models of governance, sort of, is there any clarity that we can find in state laws to tell us how we should be governing our town forests? Well, unfortunately, the answer to that question is not really. And so, as I was saying, in my research, I've found that really, I think that there are three main areas that contribute really to this governance question. But again, I'm not a legal expert, and this is not sort of an area of expertise. So there may be others. The three that I identified is Title 24. So those of you who are municipal officials or work in town government are probably very familiar with this statute. Title 24 really is the kind of the statute that outlines duties, power, and responsibilities for a lot of aspects of our municipal government. And so this includes things like select boards, town administration, I think, is included in there as well. I mean, it's a big title, so it's a big area of statutes. And I'm not going to provide a overview of all that's in it, but I think town administration, which town managers kind of do play into this conversation, are included in it. But it's also where you'll find the enabling legislation for conservation commissions. And as many of us know, and we'll talk more about in a little bit, conservation commissions obviously play a really big role around the state in, sort of helping, assisting and advising local leaders, local municipal officials in terms of management and stewardship of natural resources. And for a lot of communities, that includes the town forest. The second area of Vermont law that I think is a little bit more germane to town forests in particular is the Municipal Force Act. And I mentioned this earlier. This was the law that was passed, or statute that was passed back in 1915. It was actually amended in 1970. But this is where you find all of the enabling legislation that actually allows towns to purchase land for the purpose of, and originally it was growing wood and timber. I think school forests were another part of that. But it actually allows towns to purchase land to designate them as town forests. Now, in this act, it talks a little bit about, it gives some parameters about what it means, for a town to acquire a town forest. It talks about acreage. So I think there's like a limit of the acreage has to be at least 40 acres. And it also identifies a role for Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation in designating a municipal forest, which many of us call today town forest. So it does provide a little bit of guidance, but again, it doesn't really hit this whole area around governance and how we structure that. And so then the final piece I think that plays into this conversation are municipal charters. And this is specifically, I've come across this a little bit more in my work with urban forestry. Municipal charters, I know from some of the communities I've worked with over the years, are a place where towns can specifically create committees. And some of my earlier work with the UCF program supporting tree boards around the state, they used municipal charters to actually create a tree board and give it authority for managing street trees and public trees as in an advisory role to the select board. So I think municipal charters are also, again, a place where communities can sort of create some more authority around the creation of a town forest committee. Okay, so given that kind of overview and sort of grounding in the reality of here in Vermont, I think it's really interesting to share that just over the border in New Hampshire, it's a totally different story. And in fact, I have to be honest, I was talking to a colleague in New Hampshire the other day, and I'm a little jealous. In fact, in New Hampshire, the statutes are really clear. They spell out, sort of the governance structure for town forests. And actually, they say that town forests are exempt from selectmen's authority. So the town forest governance is really done by a forestry committee or the Conservation Commission if a municipality has one. And in fact, the statutes go further to spell out how many members a how many members should be on a forestry committee, and what their number of years of terms should be. So it's really interesting to see that New Hampshire actually has some pretty significant clarity around this issue. So why does this all matter? Why is it important? I think that there's a lot of reasons that we, we need to have this conversation and explore sort of the different structures of governance in town forests here in Vermont. And I've included a couple of them here for you folks, and I'm sure, feel free to use the chat box maybe to add other reasons as well. I think many of our communities here in Vermont, especially after COVID, have been experiencing, sort of competing demands, increased use, there's a need for a body of local officials to decide, what uses are allowed and what's not allowed. Another reason, I think that's important to state is, volunteers. A lot of the work in town forests, as you all know, is done by volunteers. And so there's a high turnover rate. And actually, we'll highlight that a little bit further into the presentation when we talk about some of the research we've done here in Vermont. But creating sort of institutional knowledge, I think, is an important role, an important aspect of why governance is really important. And then finally, this community involvement and input piece, I think, is really important. I know in talking to colleagues, I think we can recognize that over the last 20, maybe 25 years, I think there's been a real big shift in expectations around town forests, and in particular around public involvement and input. I can remember when I started the program about 15 years ago, a lot of town forests were just managed by select boards, and there weren't committees, sort of engaged in making decisions. It was, decisions were all made by select board members. And again, I recognize many of you on the call have been involved in this area for a number of years, and you're welcome to share more about that and your experiences around that in the chat box as well. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. So that was just kind of the overview and sort of the context of what we're talking about when we're talking about town forests governance. I wanted to share, we actually, in 2020, 2021, we did some work here in Vermont, actually contracting with the Northern Forest Center to do an assessment to look at what was happening around town forest governance here in the state. And these are our three main questions. The first is who's doing what? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The second is, how's it going? We wanted to get a handle on, okay, so, we have a sense of like, we want to know who's doing what and kind of what models and what groups are actively engaged in making decisions or doing the work around town forests, but how's it going? And then what are some of the challenges and needs? And this work really, was a partnership with the Northern Forest Center. The Vermont Land Trust was involved, the Urban and Community Forestry Program, obviously, Forest and Parks. We had a number of partners really coming together to kind of help us think through, the questions that we wanted to ask as part of this work. So I'm going to just sort of speed through this a little bit because I want to make sure that we stay on time. But the assessment was actually comprised of two parts. There was an online survey, and you can see who that was targeted to here. In the list, community members, consultant foresters, as well as county foresters. And in addition to the online surveys that were targeted to individual audiences, we also ran 3 focus groups, or the Northern Forest Center ran 3 focus groups. And here's the quick breakdown of who we engaged with. So you can see the pie chart on the left gives you a sense of, who really responded. And you can see the top 3 were Conservation Commission members, town staff, and special committees. So what did we hear? And I apologize. I know this slide is really busy, so I'm just going to summarize kind of the highlights. So as I mentioned, one of the questions that we asked was, who's making the decisions around town forests here in Vermont? So we really wanted to know kind of what was that governing body that was making decisions? And by and large, I think for many of us, it's not a really big surprise. select boards were identified as that real key player who are making most decisions around town forests. You can see here on the left-hand side, everything from policy development to financial management to stewardship decisions, dealing with conflicts, rose to the top, and of course, acquisition. So by and large, here in Vermont, select boards are really the ones that are responsible for, making those decisions. Second was conservation commissions, and then town forest committees. One of the other things I wanted to highlight on this slide is look how many players are involved. I think it's pretty unique here in Vermont that we have all these different groups of people, or excuse me, all these different groups of committees and organizations, that have a piece of the pie, if you will, right? A stake in the decision-making process. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and look at who's doing the work. And so again, things, probably not super surprising for many of you on the presentation today. The work really shifts, right? Sort of the question of who's doing the work, things shift. Conservation commissions, by and large, and town forest committees are much higher than select boards. I think, acquisition, obviously, there's legal aspects of that. And so select boards are still high. Infrastructure and communications, actually, I was surprised to see select boards were as high as they were. But again, here in Vermont, lots of players, lots of different groups that are doing the work of town forest management. So I'd love to just take a second and ask you guys, how does this align with what you've seen, the work that you're doing in town forest? Does that align with what you're seeing? Any ahas or any?
It looks like Kimberly has her hand up. If you'd like to go ahead, Kimberly, and share.
Sure. Yeah, I guess. Well, I don't know if this is an aha or maybe just more of like an observation or question. I think so I'm on the Conservation Commission in Williston, and if you asked us if we make the decisions around Catamount Community Forest, I think we would technically say no, right? The select board makes the decisions and we weigh in and write memos and provide recommendations. And then there's separately another forest management committee that does the same thing. And we have a conservation commission member that liaises to that committee. So I think the select board technically makes the decision, but the process by which they get all of the information and the expertise and things like that is done at the commission level. So I guess I'm just curious, like, did you see any trends or nuance around like there's the group that the buck stops with, but then the group that's like providing all of the information to the group that the buck stops with? Does that make sense? I don't know if I said that in the most concise way.
Yeah, no, Kimberly, I appreciate you mentioning that. And I think that is consistent with what we found. I think that, the by and large, sort of the commissions, the Conservation Commission or Town Forest Committee, is doing that sort of heavy lifting of hosting those community input sessions or, sort of engaging with the community in the forest on the land. And that, sort of that authority piece, right? Sort of the actual decision-making piece, sort of does rest with the select board. But, I think if you, we could go back to that slide. If we see here, I do find it very interesting that, again, so this is based on responses to our survey. So it's not a perfect, inventory of exactly what is happening in every community. But, I think it's a pretty good snapshot of, sort of the perception maybe locally of, that decision-making power and authority. And you can see things like policy development, that conservation commissions and town forest committees may not be as high as select boards, but are, a fairly large component of, sort of the those who are perceived in that decision-making role. Does that make sense? Darren, looks like you had your hand up, so I welcome thoughts or questions.
Yes, just getting myself unmuted and video on. Yeah, I would agree with Kim that, there's a lot of the work that goes into the decision making happens with the Conservation Committee here in Essex. But ultimately, there's that decision is finalized at the select board level, and sometimes by the public, depending on what the issue is. But the other thing I'll just point out is how much variation there seems to be from town to town, and that seems pretty typical for Vermont in many ways. But just that it can be focused on the conservation committee or the town forest committee in one area, but then if there isn't that for another town, the select board really is taking that on, and it depends on the capacity of the select board. And I know ours is really busy with a million other things, so they kind of see this as, yeah, let someone else take the reins on this for the most part. And also that larger towns probably have a lot of staff doing a lot of the work too.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. And, as I recall, some of the responses from the survey really talked about, the role of the select board as being a piece, right, of that decision-making process, but recognizing that they have so many other things going on in the community that, sort of they can't be the be all and end all, of the town forest management piece, right, that they get pulled in multiple directions. So that's great. And I encourage us to continue this conversation. It's really there. And I think, as you mentioned, it is a mix here in Vermont. And I think, the important piece of, sort of hearing from each other and learning it from each other's experience, I think is essential and really beneficial. I did want to just quickly share some quotes from the respondents in the survey, because I think that it speaks a little bit to some of this. So, again, we, as part of the survey, we asked folks to share kind of not only what was happening, but how they felt about it, right? So to, sort of gave them some parameters to think about quality of governance. And so we had them rate on a 1 to 5 scale. And what we heard, these are some of the quotes that we heard from respondents, for everything from, we have incredibly strong leadership, stewardship committee and the conservation commission and the select board all work together. They're all very engaged, very active. This was one of the respondents who responded that everything was excellent. And then we also heard from some communities, sort of that things were either, sort of okay, mediocre. I can't remember exact wording of the survey, but, sort of or that things weren't going very well. And so you can see the bottom two I think are sort of on the other end of that spectrum. I have to say, I really am intrigued by this one that says, I'm trying to hide this forest from other select board members who seem to have forgotten about it. I feel like there's a lot to unpack there. Again, it wasn't a survey, so I think just understanding that perception exists out there, and that sort of that's the other end of the spectrum, right? From everybody's communicating and active, engaged. So let's keep moving. I wanted to talk just really briefly about some of the challenges that we saw. So again, we asked folks to share, sort of some of the challenges that they were experiencing around town forest governance. And in fact, actually, as I mentioned earlier, it's important to remember that this survey was actually a combination. And so this, what you're seeing here on the screen, is actually a combination of responses from community volunteers and community staff, staff members, town staff members, as well as consulting foresters and county foresters. So it's a real mix of perception here. But frankly, I was really surprised to see, that the highest percentage of responses went to lack of knowledge of forest management. Gwen, I think, and rest of the UCF team, I think that there's a town forest management webinar series for town forests out there to happen in the future. But again, some of these are probably not surprising. Things like conflict between user groups. We know that that's happening out there. Lack of volunteers. We talked a little bit about how a lot of this work is done by volunteers. And so how do you retain those volunteers? How do you keep them engaged? And then you can go on down the list. Turnover on committees. Again, I think that has to do with the volunteer nature of the work, and lack of knowledge of volunteers. Interestingly enough, I just wanted to highlight existing town organizational structure was one of the lowest. And so that's interesting to me, because again, if we're thinking about these governing bodies, it makes me wonder, sort of as we're talking about challenges and barriers around governance here in Vermont, that it's probably not the actual governing body structures that are the most kind of limiting factor. So something maybe for us to dig in to further and and explore in follow-up work. Okay, so just to summarize again, what we heard on this survey, Darren, you said it perfectly. It's a mix. It's a mixed bag here in Vermont. It's a combination of select boards, conservation commissions, town forest committees. They all have a role either as part of that authoritative piece or part of that work on the ground. And frankly, if you look at sort of the top 3 authority bodies that have authority around town forest decision making, it is those 3 entities. I also mentioned, we asked about quality. I think it's important to acknowledge that 58% of responses for our survey said that things were actually working smoothly and effectively. They said that we have good to excellent, governance happening around our town forest. So I think that's actually really great news, right? I think it can kind of put us at ease. Sometimes I think when we have these conversations, we think, oh, things aren't going well, we have these major challenges. Well, in fact, actually, for 58% of respondents, they felt like things were going well. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears once again, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about what good governance looks like. And I'm using this kind of as an opportunity to sort of wrap up this piece of the webinar, because I think it's important to acknowledge that, even though 58% of our folks here in Vermont who do work around town forest governance feel like things are going really well, or good to excellent, there's always opportunities for improvement, right? And I think we also are seeing some of those challenges around conflicting uses and sort of conflicts that are happening both out in the forest and in the community around town forest management. And so, not to get very academic with you, but I wanted to share, these, there's actually 5 principles that are proposed by an international community forestry group called the Governance of Forests Initiative. And I actually added communication as a sort of a 6th piece, because I think based on our feedback here in Vermont, that was identified as such an important part of why people felt like town forest governance in their community was going well. So when we think about, what good governance really looks like, I think we can think about things like accountability, participation, transparency, coordination, capacity, and again, the communication piece. In the interest of time, I guess, just thinking, we can kind of walk through what each of these means, but I'd love to hear from you guys, as you can sort of read the descriptions here on the screen. I'd love to hear in the chat, from folks, do you have, sort of a sense of which of these principles, which of these areas, are most challenging for your work in the community? So is it things like, kind of creating and clarifying that responsibility? Is it things like, that participation piece, right? Having representation from all the different stakeholders engaged in some aspect of those governance activities, right? And that includes, diverse and meaningful input from, full range of folks sharing different perspectives on different issues. Is it things like transparency? Is it things like making the process clear, and open, timely, comprehensive, and available to folks in the community? Is it things like coordination? One of the things we heard in the survey was that coordination between boards, right? We talked about all these different players. How are they coordinated? Are there people sitting on multiple committees or multiple boards that help sort of serve as sort of as connections? That word's not coming out right now, but you know what I mean. Liaisons, thanks. Thanks, Gwen. I see we have a note in the chat box. And then capacity, I just wanted to explain this one for 2 seconds because what I mean by capacity and this work that was done by the Governance of Forest Initiative is really thinking about kind of, can the community act independently? So is there access? Is there public access? Are there resources that support public access to decision making? So I see we have a note from Pat in the chat box. saying that they're all important and none are specifically difficult. So I'm curious, is that the experience of other folks, or are there one or two? And you know, I was going to have you do a quick exercise to call these out specifically, but I think in the interest of time, I'd love to just keep going. So please go ahead if you have any other thoughts about which one of those might be more difficult. Please put them in the chat box, and maybe this will spark some thoughts and conversation. When you know we talk about sort of these different areas, I think it's important to think about sort of how those town forest governance, those governance activities, right? Sort of this diagram here that shares all those different pieces that we talked about initially that make up town forest governance. Well, how are we addressing all 6 of these kind of best practices within each one of those? So if I was to pick policy as an example, I wonder for our communities, sort of what does accountability look like around policy? Do you have a process for creating, establishing, or revising policy? Is it clearly communicated? Maybe it's pie in the sky, but as we think about sort of what these best practices look like and mean for each of these activities, I think it can lead us to, some really important conversations and important questions that could help us improve on our governance structures here in Vermont. Okay, so what are the main takeaways? And I just want to kind of wrap this up with, sort of just as I see it, really the main takeaways from, what we learned and also from our situation, sort of here across the state. And that is, as I said, Darren said, it's a mixed bag, right? There's a lot of different players, a lot of different pieces, and that there's really no right way or wrong way for that matter. That it's really not a one size fits all approach. And I think that we, here in Vermont, we should celebrate that. As I mentioned earlier, communication in the survey work actually came out as incredibly important. And I think, sort of as we think about how we engage in governance in our communities, making sure that we're keeping everybody informed is really important. Excuse me. And then keeping it light. Some of you were on the community engagement webinar back in May when John Scazzaro from Randolph, New Hampshire, talked a little bit about some of the ways that they're engaging communities around their town forest. And I think that his model of a town forest day is a really cool model for us, for our communities here in Vermont to be thinking about, right? So how do we create fun and engaging ways for, residents and community members to engage in our town forest? It shouldn't always be around management issues or when there's a crisis or a conflict. How do we keep community engagement in our town forests light? Be inclusive, be welcoming. This goes without saying, but again, thinking about that representation piece when we talk about best practices around governance, I think is really important. And I think that a lot of us can acknowledge that a lot of these conflicts that we see happening at the community level really center around people not feeling like their voice has been heard or that they've been invited to the table. So making sure that as we have opportunities for the public, we're making decisions or we're looking for public input, that we're doing it in a way that is inclusive and welcoming to all stakeholders. I know that's not easy work. Happy to kind of think through with folks what that really looks like on the ground, but just want to call it out as an important piece. And then finally, we are so fortunate here in Vermont and New England. We have a lot of resources. There's a lot of different organizations. There's a lot of different professionals, practitioners who help. And so, I think as we continue to think about governance at the local level and how we manage our town forests, just want to recognize that, connecting to that network of resources is really important. And again, I appreciate and recognize that there's a lot of you who are those practitioners who are on the webinar today. So if you do provide assistance to town forests, or to excuse me, to communities around town forests, please feel free to to share that information in the chat box. We're actually in the process of pulling together a toolkit for communities very much modeled after the recreation planning process. And so we'll have those resources kind of compiled in that format, hopefully by early fall. All right, so that actually, I think, kind of wraps up my portion of the presentation. And I appreciate your patience and kind of just being a part of this journey with me. It was really fun to pull this presentation together and just really think about these issues and sort of the status of governance here in Vermont. I just want to call out Julie Renaud Evans from the Northern Forest Center, who I consider like my ghost presenter. She's a mentor and a friend and somebody who, I think has not only supported communities all across, New England, but has worked with a few communities here in Vermont. She has an incredible amount of expertise and experience in working in this area. And they were the ones who pulled together all this data for us. So just wanted to acknowledge and thank that Julie from the Northern Forest Center for her help. And with that, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit. So you've heard enough from me. And so I want to actually shift the conversation a little bit to hear directly from the communities. So we have with us today Tom Kidder, who is with the Tucker Mountain Town Forest in Newberry, and Pat Maynor, again, with the Heinsberg Town Forest. And so I'm going to stop my screen share and invite Tom to go ahead and take the reins and share a little bit about his work within Newberry, the Tucker Mountain Community Forest. So Tom, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, and you should be able to share your screen.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yep. Perfect.
Okay. Well, greetings, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here. I thought I would start off by telling you a little bit about our forest and then touch on some issues of governance. We are a very new town forest. The land was purchased by the select board in December of 2018. So it's really been about 3 years that we've been really operating. The photo that you see right here is kind of the salient feature of our town forest, which is the top of Tucker Mountain, which is all meadow. It looks more like a hill than anything else. And back here, do you see my arrow, by the way? Very good. That is Wrights Mountain. And the Bradford has a Wrights Mountain Town Forest up there, which is beautiful. And we are working on a connecting trail. That's one of our projects. This is a map of the property. It's 636 acres. There's a road that follows through this, and the road, whoops, go back. Okay. Yeah, I've lost my pointer now. But yeah, the class 4 road that goes through here, we have environmental protection zone around one of our vernal pools. And I'm going to move ahead because here we go. This is a view from the top of Tucker Mountain, which the view is actually 360 degrees, but this is looking off toward the White Mountains. And you can see we've identified some of these mountains for a sign that we have on top. This is probably the most popular spot on the mountain, and this is where the vehicles like to go as well. Here is a map showing our trail system. You can see the red line through is the class 4 road that goes through, and I wish I had my pointer. Let's see. Anyway, yeah, all the trails that you see that are those more squiggly lines are trails that we have put in the last 3 years. So we've been very active with that. And you can see on the right there, some of our elementary students in the upper right going to work on a new trail that they just built, which is a beaver pond trail. And in what we consider the children's town forest. And then we have National Honor Society students working on some trail drainage. The trail signs, we volunteer come forward who's done all of our trail signs. He has a machine that creates them by computer, which has been great. These little people come along with special talents and special tools. They just come out of the woodwork, and we've really done very well by them in our work in the last 3 years. We have another big project. It's been the installation of 3 of these kiosks. Another fortunate connection is a log home builder, John Inninger, who designed and helped construct these kiosks. We pretty much got by with just paying for the materials. He donated his labor. So we have 3 of these. We have a vernal pool, 2 vernal pools. These are National Honor Society students doing some volunteer work. We monitor these vernal pools. We have homeschool families who work on that over the past 2 or 3 years for the Vermont Center for Eco Studies. So that's an educational component of our forest. And here are some Newberry Elementary students. They finished their trail that leads to this old beaver pond, which is a beautiful spot in the forest, and they're all quite excited about it. We named it after the school. We also received some grant funding from Recreational Trails Program to build 2 parks, fence, and one of the kiosks. So that was a big step, and you can see the parking lot gets a lot of use here. We had somebody come forward and develop a website for us, and that is active, and you're welcome to go there anytime. We don't always have time to keep it up to date. I think everybody has that problem with websites. We also, very exciting right now, we're installing 10 informational signs throughout the town forest. This was from a grant from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation of $5,000, and that with our own contribution as we put together these really nice laminated signs that will be installed within the next 6 weeks. So the little bit of story of the governance here of the town forest, we had an offer from the Leach family to sell the town, this land for a town forest. The selling price of $460,000. It was appraised much higher than that. They were selling it for around half of the value. Most of that money was coming from grants and donations with a lot of help from the Vermont Land Trust. And the town was asked to contribute $25,000 to show that they were serious about it. So it went to 2 votes. We won both times. It's Vermont. Some people missed the first vote, so they demanded we have a second vote, and both times it passed. The select board was quite, they were opposed to the purchase, but the town rallied, and the select board followed, and they have been quite supportive since that time, knowing that their job is to, excuse me, I have to turn my phone off here. That their job is to support the voters, and we appreciate that. They closing was on 12/18, as you can see, that signing there. Once they closed, the first thing that we had to do was develop an interim management plan. This was before, once the vote happened, then the select board formed an interim management committee, and our job was to write an interim management plan. This was before the actual closing. So when the closing happened, we were really ready to go. So these were the landmarks in governance. First of all, we had 2 towns, and we really, some of us who were really in support of the town forest really paid attention to this, because we wanted to understand why people were opposed, and knowing that, as we move forward, sorry, somebody keeps trying to call me here. As we move forward, we wanted to include those people and win them over. And I think in the 3 years, we've done a pretty good job of that. We have, since the votes, we have not heard a lot of opposition to the town forest. We've gotten support in just about every way that you can imagine. But we do pay attention to those people who are, sort of anti having town ownership of public land. Then we formed the interim management committee, of which I was a member, and we came up with the interim management plan. We had the closing. Then the select board appointed 2 committee chairs, and I was fortunate enough to be one of them. And then we presented the board with a slate of 7 members. They were very interested in having members from all aspects all income levels, all backgrounds represented on the committee. And we did our best to do that. Sometimes it's a little hard to spur interest in some of those groups, but we did our best. And I think we came up with a pretty well-rounded committee. One of the first things we did was to conduct a couple of public meetings and a survey to find out what the public wanted. Then we went ahead and started to do our work. We launched volunteer activities. We we did the website, and we started a PR campaign, and I would say we've had a PR campaign going steadily, which is very important, I think, in terms of the success of our governance and our politics. We wrote a final management plan, had that approved by the select board, and then more recently, Friends of Tucker Mountain, a 501c3 organization, formed with our help and our encouragement for fundraising and volunteer support. For fundraising, the funds, any funds that were collected could go into the town and would be tax exempt. And the town would designate those specifically for the town forest. But there were people who really didn't trust that. They weren't sure what the town was going to do with their money. So it was much easier to have this fundraising organization. And we did it mostly for that purpose, just so people could write their checks to somebody other than the town. But it's been wonderful because we've had, like it brings in 7 or 8 more people as committee members in a sense, even though it's their own committee, but they've been helping tremendously with fundraising. They're active fundraisers and they're active volunteers. So that's been great. Throughout this whole operation, we always kind of kept in mind, as I said, that group of voters who were opposed to the town forest, and every user group that we have. We say that the town forest is a town forest for everyone. And we have, for instance, people with motor vehicles who use our town forest, and that's unusual for a town forest. But in this situation, and in that photograph you saw of the meadows, those meadows were cleared in right around 1800 or 1810, I think it was. And since that time, people have been going up there and having picnics. They would go up on horses, they would go up by horse and buggy, and then they were going up by motor vehicle. And it's the kind of thing that's been part of that mountain for, over 100 years, that people have been accessing it by some kind of vehicle. For us to suddenly say no vehicles on Tucker Mountain, which, in my heart of hearts, that would be exactly what I would love to see. We would be, instead of serving the town as a town force, we'd be taking something away from people. So we are trying to welcome motor vehicles within limits on the Class 4 road and the little spur road to the top, nowhere else. It does cause challenges in terms of ecology and erosion, but we're trying to make it more easier for people to get up there without doing damage, and trying to involve them also in the same process. So it's been working out pretty well. I can show you, for example, this is just looking at our management plan that we developed. Looking down, we are looking right now at the spur road on the top of Tucker Mountain, and you can see the kind of damage that was going on. You see that people have trouble deciding which road to take, new roads. Those roads, by the way, come washes, and they'll start another road. You'll see how many people have been out there doing donuts on the meadows. We have reversed it. We now have, just through handwork, no excavation equipment or anything else, we've managed to narrow this down to one road. And people just culturally, they're interested in what we're doing. They're supporting us. They've stopped doing, for the most part, doing these donuts and things like that. And the grass is coming back nicely. So this is the kind of erosion that we were faced with. And this is our volunteers out there working on reclaiming one of the roads. And this is what it looks like after it's been reclaimed and reseeded. So this is the kind of work that we're doing in order to accommodate and keep it open for motor vehicles. And we're also, as on the left there, you'll see a sign that gives some education about what we're doing. The reality is that early this spring, somebody got up there and drove over the road closed signs and drove over the hay bales. And but I'm an optimist, and I think we succeeded keeping this closed and keeping those signs up for a year and a half. And if one Yahoo got up there and did some damage, you know, it'll grow back. It's fine. But this is, you know, it's sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back on this kind of thing. So I just wanted to kind of give you an overview and give you a chance to ask questions. But I think in the success of our governance has been that we basically manage the town forest. The select board generally does not micromanage us. They let us do as we want until, you know, sometimes once in a while we're reminded that we need to check with them on certain things. But I do go to select board meetings fairly often whenever we're making a major decision and make sure they're fine with it. But they usually are, and they've been supportive. We try to stay positive in every situation. If we see people on Tucker Mountain driving a 4-wheel drive vehicle, those of us on the management committee will often stop them and introduce ourselves and talk to them and tell them what we're trying to do with the erosion. And in almost every case, we get a very positive response. So it's good for us to get to know them as people, and good for them to see that there are really people behind these policies. We try to build relationships with every user group. So you know, many of us on the management committee are hikers or mountain bikers or skiers. So we do have a couple of people on the management committee who are ATV fans or snowmobilers, and that's good because we need to hear their perspective and know how we can work together with them. Almost all of them, I would say, are good people and good citizens. Select board, the class 4 road, the select board refuses to do any work on it, and that's totally within their legal rights. And I understand their point of view. I think that this is just an example of a relationship with a select board. It would be very easy to go in and start complaining and try to put them on the spot about their responsibility in maintaining that road. But the first thing I did was I made sure I understood the law, and they are totally within the law to do that, and to understand their point of view of why they don't want to maintain the class 4 road, and understand that I work with the select board. We are a committee of the select board, and therefore it's not our forest, it's their forest, it's everybody's forest. And we have to remind ourselves sometimes of that in order to keep that relationship positive. So communication is very important, and letting them know what we're doing and showing it off a bit, I think has been helpful. So they've been supportive. We don't have any budget from the town. I think some of these things within the next 4 or 5 years will start to happen. I just think that the select board wants to see what we do with this and see how the community supports it. We've also used social media a lot and press to promote the vision and win support. And I realize that's not exactly governance, but I think politics is part of governance too, and winning a town our size over on this. So I kind of rushed through this a little bit because I know that the time is somewhat limited, but we'll be happy later on to answer any questions. And I also am available if you want to email me or give me a call. I'm glad. I always love to talk about our town forest and would be happy to discuss anything about governance or anything else with you. We do have one more thing I want to add. We applied for a grant. Those upper roads that you saw, they're in such bad shape. Our solution to that is to build one solid gravel road that doesn't wash away, that pretty much tells people this is where you go. And so it's either that or we would have to close it because we cannot tolerate the kind of erosion that's going on up there. So our solution, besides what handwork we've done, is to get a grant or not get a grant. Somehow or another, we're going to raise $40,000 to get that road in good shape. So it's like a good driveway with good drainage and culverts, and have some kind of a maintenance fund so that we can keep it that way. And then we're all going to be very happy, both those who drive their motor vehicles up there and those of us who try to manage the land. So thank you for the opportunity, and I will unshare.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom, for that very informative overview of what's going on in Newbury. And so next up, we have Pat Meaner, who's going to tell us a little bit about what's going on in Heinsberg. So Pat, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
I really enjoying this webinar. It's always interesting to hear about what other people are doing in their town forests. And I think, Tom, you already gave me some ideas about our town forest and what we can do better just from listening to you. Heinsberg is a really, really lucky town because we have 2 town forests. One was acquired recently, 2008, and I'm just going to show a map here. That's the La Platte Headwaters Town Forest, and that's a newer acquisition for the town of Heinsberg. In a way, it's 2 town forests. The southern portion is wooded, and we do not allow any horses, ATVs, or motorized vehicles on it. So it's pedestrian use only. That's really based on the soils because the soils are pretty clayey and not very well drained. And it's hard enough to maintain trails in good shape for just pedestrians there. It's not as heavily used as our other town forest. A lot of local daily walkers, a few people from the rest of Chittenden County. I don't think it's very often visited by people from other parts of the state. The northern part of the town forest, if you can see with where I'm pointing with my mouse, is a floodplain. It was originally a floodplain forest, but of course our early farmers drained it and cleared it. And sometime in the 1960s, it was planted with reed canary grass, which means nothing grows through it. So since the town acquired it, we've planted quite a few trees there, most recently with a grant from the Nature Conservancy. U.S. Fish and Wildlife has been involved, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and the state have all provided funding for planting trees there. Recently, the beavers have been helping us, seeing as we planted food for them. They've come along, but our nemesis is deer there because we have an overpopulation of deer that likes to eat about half the trees we plant before they get too far. So that's kind of an ongoing project. We have another town forest that was acquired starting in the 1930s as hill farms were abandoned and bulk milk trucks couldn't get up on the hills. This is a higher elevation forest topping out around 1,700 feet. And it's probably the town forest you most often hear about being associated with Heinsberg. I guess kind of the governance of town forests began then. Originally, the select board managed the town forest as acres were added to it. Eventually, I think sometime in the 50s, we had a town forest commissioner, one person who managed it. Somewhere he died, I guess in the early 80s, and his son took over as commissioner, and the select board decided we should have a committee. So we were a 5-person committee. We were very informal. I don't think we ever met inside a room. We met outdoors to paint boundary or look at some trails that these kids wanted to build, early mountain bikers. And we didn't keep minutes or do anything. The chair would say, I think Mike Schneider, the county forester, thinks we ought to do a little logging in this area. The ash would be great for our town forest floor, our town hall floor. And so everything happened very informally. Gradually, what is now Fellowship of the Wheel built a nice network of trails there. And most recently, and this is really exciting, another reason why Heinsberg is lucky, we've been able to add this parcel to our town forest, 291 acres, and conserve the whole thing. So this map is a little out of date. It should have the gray lines to show that it's conserved. I'm trying to think. Recreational use has drastically grown since the 1980s. We were part of the recreation study and actually found out how many people are enjoying our town forest. And I think I'm sure the use has even intensified because of the pandemic. So that was another reason it was nice to add more land to spread people out a little bit. Our committee meets once a month as a general rule of thumb. The select board in 2009 told us to write a management plan for the Heinsberg Town Forest. It took us 3 years, lots and lots and lots of public participation, and it seems to have worked. We wrote an interim management plan for the addition, and now we are in the process of finalizing a new management plan 10 years after our old management plan for the whole parcel. We tried very hard to solicit lots of public feedback. We were prepared to hire a facilitator for a big public meeting because we thought we might get 50 people, as we did back in 2011 and 12. We got 2 people, which was kind of disappointing. And we don't know quite what to make of it. We think maybe people feel that they're satisfied with the way things are and have some confidence. The big issues are dogs, ATVs, and horses, which I guess is pretty common, motorized vehicles. That's why, Tom, it was good to listen to you. Trying to think, our biggest challenges over the years have been creating a shared vision. I learned back when we were writing our first management plan for the Heinsberg Town Forest that if you have 25 people in a room, you probably have 35 different visions for the forest and how it should be used. But we worked through a lot of compromise. Managing humans is the challenge. We allow horses and motorized vehicles on 2 hardened roads, but keeping them there is the challenge. They don't stay where they belong. Communication, when is the forest open? When is it closed? When is it too wet? That's an ongoing challenge. I mean, we just have to do it. It's not hard. The whole accountability and transparency and communication, coordination pieces don't seem particularly hard. They just take a lot of time and attention from committee members. We do coordinate with our Conservation Commission. We had beavers flood a trail recently and did a site visit, and members of the Conservation Committee were there. We coordinate with the Trails Committee and the Fellowship of the Wheel, and we've gotten lots and lots of help from our county forester and other people from the state, from Fish and Wildlife. I could go on and on and on. That forest is used heavily for education, which is a great thing. I'm trying to think if there's anything else related to governance. I guess one of our challenges is sometimes lack of hard data. That's why the recreation study was good, but I guess I would have a question at this point. How many people are using motor vehicles on the town forest? And we don't really have a good way of knowing that. We have, Tom, you mentioned user groups. We have the user groups for pedestrians and bicycles. We know some people who want to ride their horses wherever they are in the town forest, but they have not come up with a user group. And no one admits to riding an ATV or a dirt bike in the town forest. We've met a few people, chatted with them, had nice chats, but they never come forward in any sort of to any meeting to talk with us. So those are some of our challenges. And we've had success. The addition and conservation project was so well received. Vermont Land Trust and VHCB certainly did most of the heavy lifting, but it was sort of astonishing the number of members of the community who donated to make that happen. So I guess that's all I have to say. I'd love to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pat. And so we do have a little bit of time for questions. I welcome folks, either, if you have a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and turn your video on and ask it live, or to go ahead and put it in the chat box. As we're waiting for more questions to come in, I had the opportunity to look back over some of the comments that were shared. Tom Darren had shared that they are experiencing issues around roads in Essex, class 4 roads in particular, in their town forest in Essex as well. So definitely a connection there. One of the questions as we're waiting for participants to submit questions, one of the questions that I wanted to ask both Pat and you, Tom, is, as I was sharing kind of earlier around those best practices, Kim in the chat box had mentioned participation. And both of you have talked a little bit about kind of how expectations around town forest use, trying to be everything to everyone, has been an area that has been challenging. I'm curious, for your thoughts on kind of how you, as a town forest committee, how you've addressed that, how you've navigated that. Do you fall, when those types of situations occur, do you, sort of how do you address, those desires, for people to be able to do, everything and anything, in the town forest, and sort of that public sentiment that these forests should be, available to everyone. Do you use is your management plan kind of your fallback piece to kind of help? Do you have policies in place? Just talk a little bit about that. Would be great. Thanks.
For us, our management plan is our fallback, and our management plan calls for user groups for each kind of use. We let in horses and motorized vehicles on 2 trails because they were hardened, and if they wanted, it says in the management plan, if they wanted to go anywhere else, they needed to create a user group and talk with us, come up with a proposal. And unfortunately for those 2 groups, it hasn't happened. And that to me is challenging. I would love to know how other towns deal with that.
Tom, just giving you, I think you're actually muted. So it looks like you're trying to share, and I want to make sure we hear from you. Thanks, Pat.
Okay, now I'm with you. Yeah, we haven't had too many conflicts in that way. We did have a group of mountain bikers who wanted to build a trail on the property, and we do allow mountain bikes even on our foot trails until such time as we start to detect that they're causing problems. And so far it has not been a problem. But we did have a group that wanted to build a trail, and we took a walk with them, and we told them where we thought there might be a trail. But then the more they talked, the more we talked, we realized it really wasn't compatible with our stewardship. They were talking about berms and excessive switchbacks and jumps and drops and all kinds of wonderful things that my grandson just loves. And we, it was not hard to say, no, that's not part of our plan. That's not the kind of thing we're looking for with the town forest. And I think it's because we have relationships with these people. They were, in fact, one of them has volunteered on some of our trail days and things like that. It wasn't hard to say no. Nobody seems to protest those kinds of things. And we haven't said no to too many people, so we haven't had a lot of protesting going on. So we'll see what happens when we try to close off to somebody. Very few horseback riders. And as far as I'm concerned, we welcome them. I think any bikes or horseback riders would get to be a problem if we get more and more of them. But so far, they're not that frequent.
Excellent. There's a question from Nancy in the chat box around working with volunteers, in particular, engaging younger volunteers. Nancy's wondering, if you both or either of you could share a little bit about how you recruit and retain volunteers to help with some of the work.
Pat, do you want to go?
Fellowship of the Wheel, our local mountain biking organization, does an amazing job of recruiting and organizing volunteers and putting them to work. They have regular volunteer days, and those volunteers help build and maintain the trails in good shape. Our local trails committee has a few days in the course of the year where they recruit volunteers. And I would say ages, from teenagers on up for both Fellowship of the Wheel and our Trails Committee. That seems to be a real strength of both of those organizations.
we have fairly frequently have volunteer days. Some days we might only have 5 people, which is fine. Small groups, I'm happy with 2 people because we can get jobs done, and we get a lot done that way with the smaller groups. We also will have big turnouts. And we advertise on, we have a Facebook site, we have an email list that we send out. And I have just my core volunteers, of which there are about 30 that I always write to whenever we're going to have a volunteer day. I'm always prepared. I tell people to let me know ahead of time if they're coming, but I'm always prepared for a few extras to show up. So I have a good jobs list and plenty of tools to work with. The school, the Newberry Elementary School has been terrific. This is the first time the kids had a community service day up there. It was the 5th and 6th graders. And honestly, they got more work done than the National Honor Society from the high school that came the next week. They had more stamina. They worked for 4 hours. The Honor Society worked for 2, and then they wanted to go explore and goof off, and that was fine. They all got a lot of work done. So also the Newberry Elementary staff likes to do a community service day. So while they're doing these community services days, I sort of recruit them into working on Tucker Mountain, try to make it fun for them and interesting and meaningful work. And then they keep coming back. So the National Honor Society has been up there several times. Yeah, so those have been really, really useful times. And they work, those methods seem to work.
That's great. And I would add too, in terms of volunteers and ways to engage with volunteers, I believe at one point Bradford, Wrights Mountain Town Forest in Bradford, that they were actually connecting with local businesses, that they're of course close to the Upper Valley. And so there's a number of businesses, both small and big, in the Upper Valley that actually allow employees to have volunteer days or to get out into the woods, as part of an employee volunteer program. So I just like to share that as an example and one potential source, that may be available either in your community or in your area to bring in volunteers for specific events or projects. Let's see here. So we had a couple more questions in the chat box. A comment from another Nancy about class 4 roads going through the town forest, talking a little bit about the select board and the Marshfield Town Forest Committee is thinking about throwing up a class 4 road so it becomes a public trail. Tom, I know that you guys have had a lot of conversations in Newberry about this. Love to hear some of your thoughts in sort of the idea of throwing up a class 4 road as in the interest of turning it into a public trail.
I think the only reason we might do that, it wouldn't change the town's attitude toward maintenance or no maintenance on it. It'd be more reason not to maintain it, but it would make it, we might do that if we decided to stop allowing motor vehicles. And again, that would be a huge step, and it would create a lot of division in the town because it's been such a long tradition of motor vehicle access. And so you're told the community that you now have a town forest that belongs to everybody, but you guys can't go there anymore. And many of the people who access the upper meadows by motor vehicle are disabled or not able to hike up there. I know there are lots of places in the world where people can't hike, and that's as it should be. But this is one opportunity to serve those people and the elderly, and they really do love the ability to go up there. The class 4 road is in such bad shape that you really have to have kind of a tank to drive up to the upper meadows anyway. And I kind of like it that way because I'm afraid if we really made it better, that we might have a real problem with too many vehicles getting to the top. At least we need to get that upper spur road, a solid hard packed road first before we allow too many cars up there. So yeah, we've thought about it, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. It's an option, so much, especially if you don't have that long tradition of access.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Tom. I'm really glad that you brought that up. Darren, looks like you had your hand up, and so I'd love to give you the last word and last question, maybe.
Thanks. I don't want to take up too much time with this class 4 road issue, but I'll share what's happening in Essex. We're trying to actually do forest management at our main park, Indian Brook Reservoir. And in order to get into the areas that we want to do that forest management, the only way in is class 4 road. And it's actually maybe even class 8 or something the further in you get. And the issue is that if we put any money into improving that road, it goes against the town ordinances, even if all we're doing is trying to get a log truck in there. So I'm curious, how other towns have dealt with that as well, not just from a public access perspective, because we're actually not trying to have this be an access point, except for emergencies and maintenance, but really, trying to make sure that we're not running into a legal issue. So that seems to be a common problem. I'm glad to hear we're not the only one.
I will say that I've asked our select board, if we raise money to improve the class 4 road, would we have permission to do that under the direction of the road foreman? And there's no legal issue as far as I know. They said, yeah, go ahead. And if we do win the grant and restore that upper road, we're going to have to bring gravel into the class 4 road and spread it around in order for the gravel trucks to get up there. Again, they have no trouble with that as long as we're footing the bill. They just don't want to commit any money to that road. Many people in our town live on class 4 roads and they all maintain their own roads. So if the town starts maintaining the town forest road, they're going to worry about the precedent.
Yeah, that's exactly the issue here. And so I'd be curious to know what grant funds are available. I must have missed what you mentioned earlier, but that would be really helpful for us in Essex because that's all we need to get started.
Yeah. So you could contact me about grants, the ones that we have done. Recreational Trails Program is the one that's paid off for us the best.
Awesome. That's great. And, just kind of as a wrap up, wanting to thank Pat and Tom for joining us today and for sharing, their experience and their expertise and their passion. Both of these folks are just incredible volunteers in their community, and it really shows when they talk about the work that they do and the success that they've experienced both in Heinsberg and in Newbury. So, thank you guys so much for joining us today, and thank you all. Thank you for participating, for asking great questions, for making those connections. It sounds like we've made a connection over roads, and Darren, as you were talking, one of the thoughts that I had is, I had mentioned in the beginning that we're working on some new exciting resources. One of those is a town forest demonstration library, where we'll actually start being able to kind of catalog and archive examples of different kind of demonstration projects that are happening in town forests. And some of that will be around forestry practices. So looking at different silvicultural practices and invasives treatments and kind of stewardship issues. But roads, actually, ironically enough, is one of the topics, sort of that we expect to be included as well. So I think that that's an issue that has been experienced by many across the state. So again, just wanting to thank everybody so much for taking the time to join us today and sharing, all of your expertise and questions and curiosities on this topic. We are actually, we have another webinar scheduled for next week. So please, if you are available and interested, we'd love to have you join us again. Next week's topic is going to be management planning, which I think nicely kind of aligns with some of the things that we've talked about today. Keith Thompson will be joining us and sharing some of his work in the County Forester Program, supporting communities in developing and management plans in particular. So, and then the final webinar will be with Ethan Tapper talking about implementing stewardship. And so we'll also have some more communities joining us to kind of share their stories as part of those webinars as well. So with that, thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Gwen, for making sure everything's running smoothly behind the scenes. Appreciate everybody taking the time to join us. And I hope that you'll be back next week and we'll be able to continue these great conversations. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great week. Enjoy the sunshine. I think it's still sunny out there, at least it is here in Tunbridge. And look forward to continuing these conversations and continuing this work in supporting you and all the great work you're doing out in communities. Thanks, everybody.